Now we're going to dive into the neuroscience of coaching, now that I hope all of you have a strong basis in what coaching is, what it isn't, and specifically the coaching in context framework. So in terms of the neurological basis of coaching, as of now, there is limited rigorous research on coaching and neuroscience. And part of this is because there's a lack of objective measures for coaching interventions and what effects it has. And I encourage you to look at the doctoral capstone presentation. Heidemann did a capstone with Mulcahy in 2021, where the student reviewed what objectives measures could be used for coaching interventions to understand its effects. And there was an article by Diaz et al. In 2015 that also explored this topic of how we can use more objective measures to understand the neurological basis of coaching, such as non-invasive neuroimaging and bioassay techniques. And there really have been past studies of using these techniques to show the effect of cognitive behavioral therapy. So we can really take a lead from this field. We now know a lot of evidence for how cognitive behavioral therapy impacts the brain for clients with depression, panic disorder, specific phobia, and PTSD. Let's talk a little bit about more of what these objective measures to understand the neurological basis of coaching could be. So neuroimaging could involve electroencephalography, or EEG, which is when electrodes are placed along the scalp to detect electrical changes indicating brain activity. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. This uses radio frequency magnetic pulses to map the anatomy and activity of the brain. And you can really compare images to see what parts of the brain are activated under different conditions to understand gray matter volume, blood oxygen levels, central nervous system pathways, as well as just functional connectivity between brain areas. So a limitation of using neuroimaging, however, is that you can't use these techniques while participants are speaking or moving their face or neck. So that means that we really can only use these techniques when the client is thinking or pressing buttons or typing. So that's really a limitation for using this while coaching is being done. Bioassay techniques could be more feasible, however, to understand biomarkers of coaching. One biomarker that's really non-invasive is cortisol, which is a stress hormone that can be collected through saliva with a Q-tip. And there are many different measures of cortisol, such as overall daily cortisol levels, or diurnal cortisol, as well as the cortisol awakening response. So this really shows how much cortisol decreases upon first waking, where it's usually its highest, to 30 minutes after, as well as cortisol levels in response to an acute stressor. Another biomarker is alpha amylase, which can also be detected in saliva, and this is related to ANS activity. And then heart rate variability is also related to ANS activity, and this can be measured in a non-invasive manner. And it's the amount of variation in time between two heartbeats. And this measure has been found to be related to higher mortality in many different patient populations. So if heart rate variability is depressed, then that is linked to mortality, and it can indicate autonomic dysfunction, increased sympathetic nervous system tone, and decreased vagal tone. And it can also, heart rate variability can decrease due to mental and physical stress. So these measures are what future studies in coaching can use to really understand the neurological basis of coaching. That being said, there are still a few neuroscience principles that really can teach us a lot about coaching. And I think coaching, in studies of coaching, we will really also learn more about these neuroscience principles as there's more evidence. So let's go over 3 different neuroscience principles. We will go over the fight, flight, freeze response, or amygdala hijack, as it is called. We will go over the stress response and how coaching can address that. And then we will go over neuroplasticity and how coaching approaches can impact neuroplasticity for our clients. So first, amygdala hijack, or fight, flight, freeze response, Information about threats in our environment or if internal threats inside our bodies are carried by the nervous system, the sensory system, to the brain, and can activate the fight, flight, freeze response. And what is considered threatening really differs from person to person. It depends on the individual and their experiences, their environment, as well as their genetics. But the amygdala, in the end, is responsible for processing emotions and fear-related behaviors. So the amygdala in this schematic, you can see where it is in the brain. It's in the midbrain, and it receives sensory information from the body and interprets it as threatening or non-threatening. So it's responsible for processing these fear and threat-related information. And the central nucleus of the amygdala is really what produces corticotrophin releasing hormone, which leads to a cascade of hormones that eventually leads to the production of epinephrine or adrenaline that activates the sympathetic fight or flight response. So this schematic really is a simplified version of what happens with amygdala hijack. So what happens when the amygdala is activated and when something is deemed as a threat is that cortex functions are suppressed. So that is when on the right in the schematic, when a client is in a high emotion state, such as anger, fear, excitement, frustration, these higher cortex functions are disabled. So that can involve critical thinking, developing awareness, and action planning. These are things that when our client is in this state, we cannot directly work with clients on these functions when they're in this high emotional state. And it's important to note that behaviors that are not associated with directly addressing a threat are suppressed when the amygdala is activated. So this can involve addressing basic needs, such as sleeping, eating, and sexual activities. And on the left in the schematic, you can see when a client is in a low emotion, calm, relaxed state, the amygdala is not activated in this way, and we can access these higher cortex functions with our client and work on these higher level cortex action planning, developing awareness, and problem solving skills. So if our client is in one of these high emotion states, or perhaps even in a fight or flight state, what is our response as a coach? First, we really want to be familiar with, and I'm sure all of you as occupational therapists are, really aware and in tune with noticing the signs of a fight, flight, freeze response. And these can vary depending if a client has a fight response or a freeze response, but it could be indicated by faster breathing or becoming shallower. The client's face might flush or get very pale. The client might demonstrate restless movement, crying or angry outbursts, not making eye contact or really making a lot of eye contact, kind of staring someone down, or not speaking or talking more quicker than usual. And our goal here is really to support our clients to come out of this fight or flight response and elicit a parasympathetic response so that we can again return to our coaching goals of working on these higher cortex functions. And really, we can use our therapeutic use of self skills to do this. The coach can support the client to name their emotions with open-ended questions, or the coach can use reflective responding to name the emotions that the client might be feeling. And with permission, the coach can share techniques that you might use in other aspects of your occupational therapy practice that you know can elicit this parasympathetic response, such as deep breathing techniques, relaxation techniques, anything body-based, anything bottom-up. And really, therapeutic use of self, you can use it to use a soothing voice, really just to be predictable and not have anything surprising in your demeanor in your sessions. You can take a break, and really using consensual decision-making with the client so that it remains client-led, but we can help the client to address any dysregulation and respond appropriately. And again, we might need to use other tools in our OT tool belt besides coaching for clients who are really having a trauma response or who are actively traumatized. But coaching techniques are really used to being preventative so that a client would not go into a full trauma response or full fight or flight. So heart rate variability was one of the biomarkers that I brought up earlier that can be an objective measure of coaching and how coaching can impact the autonomic nervous system. And there is some evidence on that used this biomarker. So there was a cohort study with 55 clients who were all older adults with subjective memory concerns. And in this study, the intervention used a brain coaching approach, which the authors did not go into much detail about what this entailed. So I encourage everyone to remain skeptical about whether this was truly coaching as it's being described in this lecture. But in any case, there were 24 sessions, 40 to 60-minute sessions, and they were multidisciplinary interventions with meditation, exercise, biofeedback, memory training. And in the end, with the post measures, the study found that all of the measures regarding cognition, depression, anxiety, and sleep participation all had significant changes, but heart rate variability from pre to post was unchanged. So again, heart rate variability can give us an indication of autonomic nervous system function, and it can be related to stress and this fight or flight response. And hopefully future studies will continue to use this as a biomarker for coaching and its neurological basis. To further explore coaching and how it can address clients in a high emotion state where there might be amygdala hijack, here is an example for you, a short video.
I'm just so worried I'm going to fail this class. I can't get it off my mind.
It's a really overwhelming feeling.
Yeah. And every time I start to think about this paper, my stomach starts to cramp up and my head is just like racing with all these thoughts about failing.
Kate, it's so uncomfortable to go through right now. You're really in tune with your feelings.
Yeah. It is really uncomfortable. I wish I could just do like one thing to make it feel better.
You know yourself so well. What do you need right now that could make things feel just a little bit more bearable?
I really need a snack. I haven't eaten anything today.
You're really hungry.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can't think straight whenever I'm hungry like this. I think after I get something to eat, I think then I'll be more ready to study.
You mentioned that first you need to get something to eat, a snack, and then you'll be ready to start studying. So, Kate, do you want to focus on making a plan for starting your paper?
Yeah, I like that idea.
So in this example, you see one way that a coach might approach a client in this high emotion state. And it's important to note that the client was able to self-identify some of their basic needs that they would need to be able to really work on coaching in a successful way to achieve their goal of starting their paper. So again, I'd like to emphasize that coaching is occupation focused here, focused on addressing needs of getting a snack and also on school occupations of writing a paper. The next topic about neurological principles that can teach us about coaching is the stress response. So the hypothalamic pituitary axis, or for short, HPA axis, is our physiological response to stress. So I think this schematic on the right is really helpful here. The red arrows are the stimulating pathways, and the blue arrows are inhibiting pathways. So beginning with our stimulating pathway, we start in the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus produces corticotrophin releasing hormone, or CRH, and this hormone travels to the pituitary gland through the blood supply of the hypophyseal portal system. And CRH in the pituitary stimulates the pituitary gland to produce another hormone, and this is called adrenocorticotrophin hormone, or ACTH. Then ACTH travels in the blood again to the adrenal glands on the kidneys, which triggers the release of cortisol. And cortisol, we mentioned earlier, it can be measured in the saliva, and it increases arousal in the body. It inhibits the hypothalamus, which reduces the production of CRH. You can see the inhibiting pathway there. And it also regulates the immune system. So it keeps it in check and away from destroying healthy cells. So the stress response also has to do with the immune response. They're connected. So again, we have a cascade of hormones that starts in the hypothalamus and leads to the adrenal glands, which ultimately results in cortisol. And cortisol, when it's working well, actually helps to control the stress response so that we don't have chronic toxic stress. And it also regulates the immune system. So what does coaching and cortisol have to do with each other? Well, cortisol can be a biomarker to see how coaching can impact the stress response in different populations. And there has been some research on coaching specifically with cortisol measures. First of all, this study by Nicholson et al. In 2020, the study design was a pre-post design with a cohort, and there was a control group here and a intervention group, and they used a positive psychology intervention. So while this wasn't coaching directly, this is a positive psychology technique that really can be effectively used in coaching. And we'll show you an example of that in a moment. But this technique is called the best possible self. So this technique can be used with writing, with visualization, and for conversation, but it asks the client to write down or speak about descriptions to envision the most beneficial outcome in their lives for specific topics. And this relates to coaching because coaching is about having the space to imagine the best possible version of yourself and making choices based on that. So this can be focused on personal aspects, relational, so social participation, as well as professional, such as work or school. And the clients in the study did this for 5 minutes, once a day for 2 weeks. And in the end, they found that the intervention group had significantly decreased cortisol awakening response post-intervention. So this again is a measure of cortisol in the saliva upon first waking and 30 minutes later. And they also found that it didn't decrease overall diurnal cortisol levels. That's important to note. So there was only one measure of cortisol that was significant here. But the author stated that these results may be mediated by significant increases in positive affect and significant decreases in worry. So that might be kind of the model of the effect of this technique. The second study by Ohashi and Katsura in 2015, this was a randomized control trial with a group coaching approach with mothers in Japan who were found to have low emotional intelligence during their screening. So they used the Japanese version of the emotional intelligence quotient scale, and they tested the hypothesis that a group coaching intervention would increase emotional intelligence and increase physiological signs of stress as measured by salivary cortisol. So the coaching intervention was delivered by trained public health nurses, and it was done in a group approach, and it focused on stress reduction and increasing emotional intelligence with parenting activities, as well as other occupations. And there were 5 sessions that each lasted 2 hours over the course of 3 months. In post-tests, the co-authors found that salivary cortisol levels, as measured by the diurnal cortisol slopes, were significantly lower in the intervention group versus the control group. And this continued at the 1-month follow-up, and there was a large effect size here. They also found that emotional intelligence was significantly higher in the intervention group versus the control group at post-intervention, as well as at the 1-month follow-up. So coaching can have effects that continue potentially beyond the closing of the coaching relationship. And it can be effective in a group model. So here we have another example video of how you might use a coaching technique, the best possible self, this positive psychology technique in the discover phase of coaching. And again, you'll see the text underneath the video will show you the different coaching techniques that are being used.
Yeah, so I think what I've really realized is that it's a priority for me to be exercising more right now.
So in your mind, when you imagine your best self exercising, what does that look like?
It's a really good question. I think exercise for me, I imagine myself really having fun with it, of it not being a chore or something that's really like that I have to cross off my to-do list, but that I can really enjoy as a form of more like self-expression, not like self-punishment or anything. And I see myself exercising as a social activity, like being around people who like friends or just people who like to do the same things as me with exercising, so that it's really like a positive part of my week that's playful and that I look forward to.
Yeah, so for you, you want to see exercise as kind of like joyful self-expression.
Yeah, that really captures it for me, which is different, I think, than a lot of the times exercise is pictured in our society of just like, like losing weight or a way to like discipline yourself.
Yeah, so that's really lovely. You're trying to look at exercise in this reframed way where you're expressing your creative side. So when in the week do you have the opportunity for this kind of creative movement?
Yeah, I think that because I want it to be really fun, I feel like on the weekends, maybe it's like when I have the most free time and like I actually could just have more opportunities to explore something new. I feel like during the week, I'm just like so serious at work. I really want to give myself more time that's not so limited to like explore this more creative side of myself.
That sounds great. It sounds like the weekend's going to be a great time for you.
Yeah, I agree.
So hopefully that gave you a really brief but helpful picture of how coaching can be used in the discover phase to address stress. Our third topic of what neuroscience principles can teach us about coaching is neuroplasticity and allostasis. So neuroplasticity is experience-dependent changes in the brain, and the rhyme that I like, I don't know who it's attributed to, but it is neurons that fire apart fail to start, neurons that fire together wire together. And it can involve the reorganization of neural networks. This can be at the level of individual neurons, or it can involve circuits of neurons that can change with experience and with repetition. And allostasis is the way that we're able to adapt to internal or external stressors. And it is the process that leads to adaptation and neuroplasticity. And the brain can have positive neuroplastic changes in response to stress. But when stress is, stress can be good, tolerable, or toxic. And the brain kind of decides when something is stressful, chooses the response to stress, and then changes its organization in response to stress. The brain is really just our central organ of stress. And if stress is chronic or toxic, the brain can have negative changes, kind of the opposite of this positive adaptive neuroplasticity. And the schematic shows us really what can impact whether stress is good, tolerable, or toxic. It has to do with our environmental stressors. It has to do with our history or current ongoing trauma and abuse, individual differences such as our genetics, where we are in our life development, our experiences, as well as what behavioral responses we have as potentially habitual, such as smoking, exercising, drinking, or diet. But all of these go into whether our brain perceives something as a threat or not a threat, and our physiological response to stress, which again has to do with this allostasis and adaptation that can lead to neuroplasticity in the brain. So neuroplasticity in response to stress, the parts of the brain that are really involved in this and that we know the most about in terms of how neuroplasticity occurs in the brain in response to stress are the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. And I really like this colorful schematic here where you can see where these parts of the brain are located. So you can really picture this. So in the hippocampus, again, the brain has positive and negative neuroplastic changes in response to stress. And we find evidence for this in animal models as well as human studies. But in the hippocampus, when animals adapt to mild stress, especially in early life, allostatic hormones like cortisol cause cognitive processes to be enhanced, actually, and increase positive mood and motivation and induce neuroprotection. But when stress is chronic and it becomes toxic, neurogenesis is suppressed and there are decreased synapses, shorter dendrites, and less growth of neurons in the hippocampus. And what we might see in this instance is memory and decision-making impairment, impaired ability to terminate the HPA axis activity. So remember that cascade of hormones that occurs with stress. And we might see major depression and PTSD, and also decreased hippocampal volume. So positive adaptation to stress can increase neuroprotection, whereas chronic stress in the hippocampus can decrease overall volume and decrease synapses and dendrites. In the amygdala, we see the opposite effect, which is very interesting. When stress is toxic, this actually causes increased dendrite growth in the amygdala, specifically the basolateral amygdala. And this behaviorally can manifest in increased aggression and anxiety, at least in animal models. In human imaging studies in the amygdala have shown that greater reactivity in the amygdala when confronted with aggressive social cues. So this higher reactivity of the amygdala can also be related to the likelihood of atherosclerosis, which I thought was also interesting. In the prefrontal cortex, lastly, when there is mild stress and we're able to adapt to it, this can increase the prefrontal regulatory mechanisms at least in animal models, in monkeys, and increased ventromedial prefrontal cortex volume. So these are the areas of the prefrontal cortex that might change. But if there's chronic stress, this also leads to decreased dendrite and dendrite growth and behavioral manifestations such as less cognitive flexibility and less decision-making abilities. And all of these changes are largely reversible in young animals, but there's not much evidence in humans, and aging might decrease this reversibility. So overall, we see that neuroplasticity and adapting to stress in a positive way causes growth and neuroprotection in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, whereas toxic stress causes decrease in the volume, whereas in the amygdala actually increases volume in response to toxic stress. So just some evidence for neuroplasticity and cognitive training. So not coaching specifically, but at least cognitive training, which I think shares a lot of similar aspects with coaching. But so on the left, this study by Holzel et al. In 2010 used mindfulness-based stress reduction, and they found that it might reduce gray matter volume in the basolateral amygdala and increase activity in the insula and lateral prefrontal cortex. So you can see this chart on the y-axis, we see gray matter concentration change in the right amygdala. And then on the x-axis, you see change in perceived stress scale score. So as the change in perceived stress went up, the concentration of change in the amygdala went down. So we can see how mindfulness-based stress reduction can actually lead to changes in the brain. And on the right, this is part of the results from Friston, Tang, and Friston 2020 article where they compared integrative body-mind training, which is a type of mindfulness training, to an active control, which consisted of relaxation training. And they found that this integrative body-mind training significantly increased gray matter volume of the right ventral posterior cingulate cortex, and that there was a large effect size with this change. And the cingulate cortex is associated with response to sensory stimuli, as well as memory and self-awareness. So you can see the percent change of the right ventral posterior cingulate cortex in comparison between this mindfulness-based stress reduction group and the relaxation training group. So what can neuroplasticity principles teach us about how to be an effective coach? So first of all, there's evidence that providing social support can really lower someone's allostatic load and perhaps facilitate neuroplasticity. We can also facilitate social integration, being a part of a community, organization, or group, and identifying with specific goals within it or roles within it. This is something we can do through coaching. This also is shown to lower allostatic load. And thirdly, we can support clients to make lifestyle changes, especially exercise is very evidence-based. So if clients are excited to explore exercise-related goals, exercise can increase neurotrophic growth factors in the hippocampus as well as the cortex. It also has been shown to increase memory as well as induce neurogenesis in the dentate gyrus and the temporal lobe. But this neurogenesis can, cease when people are exposed to chronic stress. So these lifestyle changes also have to do with stress and whether it's good or tolerable or toxic. So hopefully these give you some indications of how coaching approaches can promote neuroplasticity. So we also have an example of coaching for neuroplasticity. This is an example of the planning phase, and we're going to kind of do a comparison of a coaching approach compared to an approach that is not coaching, but might be typical of other occupational therapy approaches. So this first example is not coaching, but maybe more of a problem-solving approach.
Hey, so last week I tried out my plan for not scrolling on my phone when I wake up first thing in the morning.
That's great that you tried it. And were you successful?
Not so much. I gave it a shot on Monday, but then by Tuesday, I was back to scrolling. It's just so much fun.
Okay, so that strategy didn't work out this week, but we have other options, other things that you could try. Have you thought about, Kate, keeping your phone in a different room? Then when your alarm goes off at 7:30, just like you planned, you'll have to physically get out of bed to get it. And then you'll just be up for the day.
Yeah, I could definitely try that. I could see how it works out.
That's great that you're willing to try that. I really think that it could work too, just based on everything that you've told me about your symptoms of depression. So try that next week and let me know how it goes.
Okay, I'll give it a try.
Okay.
So this problem-solving approach might be really appropriate in some instances with some clients, but hopefully this will show you what approach that is not coaching is. And then we can compare this to the coaching approach with the following video.
So last week I tried out my plan for not scrolling on my phone when I first wake up.
Did TikTok tell you they missed you?
No, they still saw me every morning. They can't get enough of me.
Kate, you're so honest. It's really a strength of yours.
Thank you. This just feels like a big time sink in the morning. But in the same way, it also feels like the only way that I can wake up.
You needed to feel more awake.
Yeah, I do. Maybe it's okay that I need to look at my phone in the morning to feel more awake.
So what are some ways you can look at your phone in the morning that are really in line with what you want to be getting done?
I could set a timer, or I could watch videos while I'm brushing my teeth.
Those are great ideas.
Yeah. I could watch a music video because I know that those are only a couple minutes long. Or I could set my alarm like extra early, so that I have 2 alarms and I just get to lay in bed and watch TikTok videos for maybe like 10 minutes or so.
You have a lot of great options here. Anything else?
Um, I think that's everything I can think of.
So you mentioned you have an option of setting a timer so that you can watch videos while brushing your teeth. You could watch a music video where you know how long it's going to be, or you could kind of set 2 alarms, one so that you have the time to watch TikTok, and then one where you really have to get out of bed. Out of those, what do you feel most drawn to?
Um, I think I like the idea of setting 2 alarms, because it's really comfy in bed and I'd have like an extra 10 minutes that I could just slowly wake up, and it would be just a nicer way to wake up in the morning.
You're being really intuitive about what you need in the morning and really what you value of being comfortable and waking up on your own terms.
Yeah. Yeah, I think my plan before was what I imagined I should be doing. You know how they say that you should just get out of bed immediately. You should, journal in the morning and go on a run. Um, but I think doing this feels more authentic to me. And I think it's going to make me feel more mentally prepared for the day if I do something that makes me feel good and awake. Um, yeah, it's also kind of nice to just remember that I don't need to judge myself for this.
So this sounds like a great plan that's judgment free, and it's based on what you really need.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel really good about it.
So now that you've had the comparison, hopefully you can really distinguish the coaching approach from more of a problem solving approach and see how we can facilitate change plans for our client that might actually induce neuroplasticity. And change is really hard. So this client is potentially committing to a plan to change a habit that's very ingrained, but kind of working in an incremental way towards her ultimate goal of getting out of bed quicker. That is the end of all the content that we have for you today. I hope that you come away from this lecture with more knowledge about what the coaching approach is as an enablement skill and a conversation-based approach to occupational therapy. You understand the coaching and context model specifically and its theoretical basis. And then also you're able to apply these neuroscience principles and understand the brain more and how we can really think about affecting the brain as we are coaching. Thank you so much. And here are some references. All of them are great resources that you can check out to learn more. So thank you so much.